All right, hey guys, I'm Matt Lighty. This is the second part of the PoE 3.25 unique overview. The first episode, we looked at all the settler exclusive uniques, so things that come from shipping like Callum's Command, or that drop off of the bosses from the League mechanics such as Admiral's Arrogance off of the Admiral. In this video, we're going to take a look at the non-League uniques, the ones introduced in the patch. These are going to come in basically two different camps, and that are tinctures, which were added to the game, which came with a set of 5 unique tinctures. And then there's the ritual uniques, which were added to ritual. You have the 3 different ritual rings, which are introducing the abilities that came from Affliction League, such as Pacify, and most notably things like Penance Mark. And the Light of Meaning, which has the art of the, was it Light Within or something? I can't remember the name of it. And then there's the Parandus Pack ability, but TLDR, it's just Parandus Pack from Necropolis League, but now drops off of King of the Mist. And this drops off of King of the Mist at a pretty good rate. I believe the drop rate, does it even have it where the fuck it drops from? King of the Mist, I don't know if they have rates on him yet. They typically don't. Oh, they do. 20%, so a very respectable 20% rate. Not too hard to get. If you're even looking for a targeted one, King of the Mist, God Bless, was actually introduced in a way that makes him very approachable. From Ritual, which is you have a chance of getting his offerings, and there's a smaller chance of getting rituals that are specific to him that'll offer, depending on how much scarabs you put on and how your tree is set up, upwards of 7 or 8 different Audience with the Kings. So, fantastic route of grinding there. Not distant at all. Totally accessible. But let's actually start off with the tinctures, because I think these are the funnier ones. And yeah, we'll start from the bottom with Battle Within. So Battle Within is an Oak Branch tincture, which is the rage on hit. Gain rage on melee weapon hit, specifically melee weapons, again, so not ranged hits. And the tinctures have this whole mechanic with mana burn. So this one says, does not inflict mana burn over time, and inflicts it on you when you hit an enemy with a weapon. So instead, it's based off of the hit. So if you hit less frequently, you drain, you get less mana burn. You gain rarity per mana burn up to a maximum of 100%. So if some way you could utilize that, this works as basically a MF trinket, giving you not only Culling Strike, but potentially upwards of, I guess, 500% rarity in some hyper niche, maybe not even possible circumstances. Let's check the usage of that and see how popular it is. Okay, so we have 21 people using it, which is infinitesimally small. And tinctures, again, there's no way to automate them. You click them, and then you start mana burning. Or if you grab, there's a keystone, I believe it's this one. Okay, so yeah, Blood Soaked Blade, it is like a life burn versus mana burn. But yeah, the uptime of them is pretty good. It's very active to click them. Since it's an 8-second cooldown when deactivated, there's ways to reduce that, increase that. But this also just gives you Culling Strike with melee attacks. So in a way, it's 10% more damage. If you have no resource from Culling Strike, would you like to allocate a tincture that also gives you rage buildup, but more importantly, gives you Culling Strike and a little bit of rarity? Yeah, I could see that being the case. Outside of that, I think its application's pretty niche. You're just not going to see many people using it. Looks like a lot of just meme builds, just putting stuff on. This guy's actually using it. It is a way of gaining rage passively. If you don't need your mana per se, the mana burn is not much of a problem. If you have ways to reduce the mana burn, or this guy again picked up the Blood Soaked Blade, so it becomes life burn. It's much more easy to manage. But yeah, that's basically it for that one. It just gives you Culling Strike, a little bit of IR, and some rage generation. Next is the Wildfire Floam, which is a ash bark, not ass bark. Everything makes me want to say ass bark. The tinctures themselves, the implicits, are quite strong, giving you 90% increased damage with Ignite from melee weapons and a chance to Ignite, so very Ignite geared. It has a -1 fire damage taken from hits per mana burn. Basically negligible. Chance to refresh Ignite, though, not negligible, because it's going to work the same way as Ignite application, I imagine, which is the highest Ignite is taken and kept, so the highest one should be refreshed. And then covering enemies in Ash is a huge damage boost. I believe it's 20% increased fire damage taken. It might be 10%, but Ash is quite strong. There's not many ways to get Ash, so this is basically going to be a Ignite melee on hit build. Let's take a look at what its representation is. All right, 7, so incredibly small. Incredibly small. Yeah, not many people using it. Again, not surprising, because a lot of the problem with these unique ones is they're going to be just better to use a normal magic one, because the prefixes, suffixes, and the magic ones are just so much stronger than most of these unique abilities. But if there's no other way to get Ash, then the Ash one is perfectly acceptable. So here's an example of a guy playing, looks like Tech Slam of Cataclysm. So he's not scaling in any way, really. He's not scaling the fire damage to ignite. He's basically just using this for Ash application, which honestly is what I would probably do if I was forced to use this thing. I probably would give up on the rest of it in a way and just say, all right, I'm not going to bother scaling ignites too much. I'm just going to kind of be a slam build that does have 100% fire damage. Therefore, that is just 20% more damage. We looked at the last flask being the Battle Within, which could be used just for Culling Strike. This could be a similar thing where a lot of its function might not be super applicable to your build, but just getting Ash. I mean, covering full life enemies in Ash for 12 seconds, most map bosses are dead in 12 seconds on a decent build, easily. Rares, without question. So this effectively makes it so if you push this button, you gain 20% single target damage for most likely the duration of that entire fight. Not to mention the increased damage with ignites. I mean, it's an amount of damage you'll probably gain. I wouldn't be surprised if these builds maybe RT potentially, because it's kind of irrelevant for that part of it, or have no actual fire application for igniting, but just the Ash damage is enough. So that'll be a lot of the field, if any, using this. But again, it's just not going to be super useful. This guy's using it for Ash, and again, a similar situation. He's using it for free Ash application, and he's doing a cold to fire situation. So he's got a cold to fire thing going on to give some fire damage, so that Ash is a non-negligible amount of damage. Next is the Might Blood Ire, which is an Ironwood. Ironwood is the stun melee weapon one. Stun is actually like a decent defensive mechanic, but unless you're playing something like maybe Bone Cheddar, which actually gains AoE from stun, it's kind of whatever. The big part of this, though, is it's free splash. Now, the reason that that's kind of weird, and I'd be surprised if people are really using this, and I'll show you why in a second. 9. Yeah, it's really not going to see much representation, and the reason's quite simple. Melee Splash isn't hard to come by because you have Tribal Fury, which gives you Melee Splash for 4 points. Now, you're saying, is 4 points worth a flask? Well, this is 100% uptime, plus you get access to a mastery, of which are quite good, I would say, for the melee attack masteries. Would I rather do that than use a flask? Yeah, I think I would. Flask is, because you're considering what is a flask equal to. You're equal to explosions, you're equal to progenesis, you're equal to, even block from Arumis, or even just a better onslaught. This guy's now running a fucking onslaught flask. So it's like, yeah, I don't think it makes much sense, like the sacrifice of 4 points for plus consistency, considering the flask does offer splash, but you have to then deal with pushing a tincture and dealing with that whole scenario. I don't think it even comes close. I don't know what they would have to add to this to make it worth using over the fact that I would say almost every build that's doing slammer strikes is in the bottom left of this tree at some point, of which there is really easily accessible melee strike skill splash. Now this obviously, it only applies to strike skills, right? And the weird part, here's the thing. So melee strike skills deal splash damage. Now, he's not using a strike. I don't know if he realizes this in that setup. The heavy strike is a strike, but the heavy strike is really only used for single target because he has the Sunder set up for, I imagine, AoE. This guy just might be cooked. I'm not sure what exactly is happening here, but it does specify strike. You can only splash a strike. So, yeah, I don't know what exactly is going on with this man's build in particular, but keep that in mind that you can only splash a strike, and if you're striking, you have the mastery for strike, additional strike behind Tribal Fury, which is so valuable. So for 5 points to get an additional strike and to get splash is like kind of a no-brainer, right? So that's where this tincture really falls off, is its real use application is like extremely limited. You're playing a strike skill that isn't in the bottom left of the tree, because otherwise you'd always take for 5 points splash and a strike. I don't know. So that's basically it. I would say it's kind of has no place at the moment. Now, next is Sap of the Seasons, which was literally nerfed because it was too strong. So it says melee damage pens 1, pen per mana burn up to 200%. Previously, it didn't have that 200% cap, and people were doing ways of scaling mana burn nigh infinitely and having, like, I believe it's thousands of elemental penetration. Now, there is a diminishing return factor when it comes to Elipen, but yeah, if you could have 1,000, yeah, there's no problem with that. Now, it's still very good. It's still actually a lot of pen, and the fact it's on a prismatic tincture, which is a great tincture base, 100% increased elemental damage with melee weapons. Again, melee only, right? But that's still a large amount if you can gain any sort of benefit from that mana burn factor. It's definitely usable. 300 people using it, so it's a decent chunk of players using it, like a good representation. And you'll see it on builds like this guy, which this is definitely a high-end build. He has Mage Blood, he has specific, you know, he's doing a stacking setup, he's doing Energy Blade, he's got Flesh and Flames. This is like clearly a high-end setup. And he's chose to use Sap of Seasons as his one non-Mage Blood flask. There's a reason for that. It's that if you can get that mana burn rate high enough, I mean, I'm not sure if you can reach 200% consistently, easily, but even hypothetically, if you're only at 20%, 30%, with one flask to grant 30% pen and 100% plus elemental damage with hits, like, that's a great value out of a flask. You're still playing an active playstyle of using a tincture. You have to click it, you have to manage its cooldown, you have to deal with the fact that you are dealing with mana burn and counteract that in some way. But for what it offers, yeah, that's a lot. That could be a lot of damage if you could somehow still crack it to get that 200% consistently with keeping high amounts of mana burn up. Huge amounts of damage for really probably minimal investment, even just in a normal scenario of just getting high stacks of mana burn. So yeah, I would say Sap of Seasons is without question still good. Again, the only downside of these things is it's locked to melee weapon damage, right? So it's 100% damage with melee weapons. Melee weapon damage penetrates per mana burn. This is a guy here who's using ballistas. I don't know if he realizes it's melee weapon damage specific. He may not. I don't know otherwise why you would never, like, unless I'm missing something here. It's very possible people don't realize that it says melee weapon only. Because, yeah. Maybe they don't. But it's melee weapon. It's with melee weapon, so if you're not using a melee weapon, it's not going to do anything. Like, Lightning Strike has a melee tag, so that's still doing melee weapon damage no matter what. You know? But if you're not using a melee weapon, obviously, it doesn't work. Yeah, but this guy's using it. He's actually chose not to do Blood-Soaked Blade. Maybe because when you're scaling mana burn that high, probably just fucking kill yourself instantly. Who knows? Either way, Sap of the Seasons, definitely I would say, so far from the four we've looked at, the best one without question. The other bottom three are somewhat unusable. Sap of the Seasons is a great tincture. Next is, I think, definitely the other contender, being Grasping Nightshade. Now, this is a Spore Bloom tincture, which is blind and blind effect, a non-negligible defensive stat. Again, I would put it in a similar tier as something like Stun, where it's an offensive defensive stat. You have to do something proactively to gain the defenses, but it is quite nice. Now, this one applies 2 to 3 Wither debuffs, you know, your hits. So multiple Wither debuffs, which is increased chaos damage taken from the enemy that stacks quite high, including afflicting Grasping Vine. So, which is just more, that's also another defensive measure, kind of like a Temp Chains-esque effect. So this one, I think, will have decent representation also. Grasping Nightshade. It's less than I thought, but still pretty good. So there's some fun things with this, though, in general. Like, it's definitely worth using on any build that is doing Chaos, I would say. It can give you high-hitting Chaos ability, so this one's using probably Zenith, right? No, it's just using regular Molten Strike. Okay, so definitely still playing Original Sin, still playing Replica Alberons, you know, that whole spiel. Doing Crown of Eyes, like this guy's got all the nuts and bolts. But he's hitting large amounts of chaos damage very fast, a lot of projectiles, a lot of hits. This is going to give him basically as much Wither debuffs as possible. You know, and it's like, oh, how many hits can you do in 2 seconds? 20, 30. Like Molten Strike, you know, you're hitting so frequently, the projectiles are returning. So this Grasping Nightshade is going to give you just huge amounts of additional single target damage. And the Grasping Vine is a non-negligible amount. The Grasping Vine stacks to 10, and it makes things basically gimp and stationary while it's active, so that one makes perfect sense. That's a meme guy, not real person. So this guy is using it. I think this also looks probably like a meme guy with RF, because he doesn't actually do a melee hit. This guy's real, so Flicker Strike, using it, so he's using it for a Chaos Damage Flicker Strike build. So he's doing, yeah, Perfect Agony. So this is a real cool guy build. but he's doing crit, poison, flicker, and again, large amounts of hits gives you large amounts of wither. Similar application to the Zenith one, but probably just way better. So here's a Zenith guy. Just a ton of fucking projectiles coming out, doing mass amounts of wither, giving you mass amounts of damage. Really just all there is to it. So of the 5 tinctures, without question, Sap of the Seasons, I would say, is the best. Grasping Nightshade is the second best. It's very, very good. Probably not, maybe not as good in a nutshell, and its application is obviously one dimension. If you were to break damage types into 5 categories, being fire, cold, lightning, chaos, and physical, this obviously affects only one plane, being chaos, while Sap of the Seasons affects 3 planes, being elemental, being fire, lightning, cold, so it definitely has a wider, broader application. But Nightshade, I would say, is basically just as good for what it does, being a tincture that is going to give you a very large amount of burst damage. Nothing wrong with that. The bottom 3, kind of turds, but that's okay. So, next up, we'll look at the rings. We'll do Hateful Accuser next, because it's probably going to be by far the most used one. This is granting you Penance Mark. Now, Penance Mark is one of the affliction marks. It's like a curse, but not. What it basically does is it puts a mark on the enemy, and when you hit the enemy, you get these little shrimps that spawn, little dudes, and these dudes can hit you. So it's spawning enemies. Think of like a Worm Blaster type build, kind of like a Writhing Jar. Really commonly used, I would say, in setups that involve cast 1 stunned build, because if you take 1 damage in a cast 1 stun build, since your stun rate's basically 0, you will always get stunned, meaning you could use this to spawn additional enemies to attack you to trigger more stuns. Long story short, it's giving you loop potential or higher single target for cast 1 stun builds that traditionally struggle with things like that. So let's take a look at its representation. Hateful Accuser. Ooh, we got a 4%er. Probably the highest of any item we've actually looked at, bar Svalin in general. So pretty much what I mentioned, you're going to see a lot of builds like this. This is a cast 1 stun build. Yep, cast 1 stun loop setups. That's really what it's used for. So Hateful Accuser gives you single target. That's kind of it. The real nice thing about these rings is they're all nameless rings, which is a great base. So it gives you reduced curse effect on you, at the downside of elemental duration on you. However, every build worth anything is going to have ailment immunity, right? Whether it's Storm Shroud or Ancestral Vision or Purity of Elements or some other way. So basically the downside's always negated on a good build. So it just has mass amounts of reduced curse effect, which is fantastic. The ring itself has life and a little bit of res and cast speed. I think they all pretty much have the same thing. Yeah, ES, life, mana, cast speed, chaos. It's pretty much the same bells and whistles. But the mark is so strong for Penance Mark. It's going to have all these auto-trigger type setups. You'll see a bunch of these. They're all going to basically look the fucking same. There's not going to be much of a difference between them, I would say. You could try to find one that's not the exact same cast on stun build. This guy's using it for some other thing. Okay, so this guy's using it to trigger Crushing Fist for a retaliation build. So a very similar thing. He probably has Cap Block, so he's using it to give him more things hitting him so he could trigger more Crushing Fists. Same principle, just different type setup, basically. But it's functioning as a counterattack retaliation type thing. Here's another one. This guy is doing, yep, another cast 1 stun setup, just a different class, different setup, but same function. You'll see him very often with Valerium. And then you pick up stun thresholds based on ES instead of life. You have 0 ES, therefore you always get stunned. Plus Hateful Accuser for Penance Mark means you always generate enemies with it. That's it. There's really not much else to say about this. It's used to generate enemies to trigger abilities for builds that have piss poor single target, that are typically cast 1 stun setups, or some sort of retaliation setup, because that's what it benefits from. So next is the Selfish Shepherd. This gives you Affliction. Affliction is another one of the ritual things. So Affliction here, what this does is target your own minions, and they take damage over time, which gives you life regen, and then they explode. Now, I don't know if there's some sort of setup you could do with causing it to maybe loop and cause enemies to explode, but let's see what its representation is. The Selfish Shepherd has 10 people. So, yeah, it's definitely more towards the unusable side. You could see it being used maybe on a Maw of Mischief Deathwish type build for, yeah, he's got some sort of a unstable golem explosion stuff going on. It's probably going to be it. There's really not going to be much more shown here except for these sort of builds. You know, just detonating their own specters or detonating their own golems. to just do a big ignite type thing. So it's your basic Maw of Mischief build, but just a different way of triggering the explosions, being Selfish Shepherd. So yeah, it's something. Niche application wasn't really needed because this sort of trigger mechanic already existed for blowing up minions. I don't really know if it has any use aside from that. Next one is Queller of Minds. This is the Pacify one. This one's weird. It basically, after most of its duration has expired, the enemies don't do damage. Now, I would say I don't know any way of making this usable, because it's a 10-second duration, so when there's 4 seconds left, the enemy is pacified, doing no damage. Okay? So I don't know how you'd ever really use this in any sort of applicable setting. Does it have anybody using it? Five Guys. Five Guys Burgers and Bites. I almost think that this guy bought the wrong ring by accident and didn't realize, because you'd want to use the other ring here to make little shrimpies. This guy, I think, is just wearing shit. You have a lot of these guys on POE.Ninja just wearing stuff. But no, I don't really understand how you'd ever really use it to do anything of importance. I think most likely people are putting these rings on builds that would normally be using Hateful Accuser just to fucking meme on people. Otherwise, I don't think it has any actual real-world application. I think it literally exists just to confuse people on POE.Ninja that are looking up Hateful Accuser builds and instead see Queller of Minds. That's my best guess, because I think realistically the ring is unusable, since you can't really plan Pacify to work in any sort of relevant situation. Unfortunate. Legally worse than Selfish Shepherd, since Selfish Shepherd does have a use of exploding minions, and Hateful Accuser is by far the best one. This one I actually think is usable at the moment, but that's fine. So, last one is Light of Meaning. This is the ring that drops off of King of the Mist at a 20% rate. This has the exact same thing as Piranha's Pact did last league, which is small things in the area of it, which is a decently large area, give you a small amount of stats. Now, that might not seem valuable at first glance if you're maybe a layman. However, you might realize that in the right position, these things can grant absurd amounts of stats. You could very easily place a Light of Meaning and give yourself something like 80 Chaos Res, which is, for 2 points, gross value. Now, a lot of them are pretty good. Some things are hard to scale, like Fizz Dot builds are hard to scale, so getting percent generic Fizz is great. Same thing with Fire Dot builds, great. Lightning and Cold is just probably worse overall, but Chaos is in a similar situation as like the Fire and Physical, which is a little bit better. A lot of these defense scaling ones are actually quite strong. ES is just inherently worse. They gave it 3%, so it's just not as good. But the evasion on Grace builds kind of makes up for the Grace nerf. The armor one, a little bit less so. The life and mana one, I feel like are a little bit bait, but people to use them for life stacking builds and mana stacking builds, I would just rather have 80 Chaos Res than deal with that. But if you're playing CI, maybe something there. But yeah, overall, I would say the real big applications are things like Chaos Res or Evasion, or like the harder to scale offensive stats. And this thing is going to have absolute bananas representation. I mean, 35% of the player base are using one. By far the most popular unique this patch in general. So represented by 35% of the player base compared to the next best thing being Fallen at 18%. It's not even close. And it's also nice because they're not going to ever be that expensive, since they're have the same drop rates. There's no waiting, it seems like, between them, and accessing King of the Mist is quite easy. Again, through ritual, through the invitation he drops from the specific ritual, and just from generic rituals that can show up. So if you are someone like me who's playing, like, if I'm sitting down to play 8 to 10 hours of Path in a real full day, I would almost guarantee I'm gonna get 5 King of the Mists, if not more, of which means I'm guaranteeing a Light of Meaning a day if I were playing like that. But realistically, I see more than that. I've probably seen 30, 40 this league, and they're not too hard, and I think I've seen every single one of these except for like 1 or 2. So yeah, it's without question the best unique of the league. Not at all too strong, I think. Could they nerf it slightly? Yeah, they could make the Chaos Res maybe a 3% over a 4%, and you would still use it. Put it in the scenario where you're getting 60 Chaos Res versus 80. Yep, you'd still use it, therefore it's still good. I don't think anything else needs to be nerfed. You can maybe make the damage ones 5%, but I think it's a perfectly positioned jewel. It's definitely not the best jewel in the game. I wouldn't even put it in the top 5. Maybe top 5, but probably not top 5. But for what it is, amazing. Yeah, it's a great jewel, perfectly balanced, I would say, in its rarity, its rate of acquisition, its cost, its use case. Fantastic, Light of Meaning. And that pretty much wraps up the review of all the 3.25 uniques, all 16 of them. In the previous video, we looked at, again, the shipping uniques and the boss uniques from Settlers. In this one, we looked at the tinctures and the newly added ritual uniques. There's a lot of cool frameworks for thing here. I look forward to seeing more tinctures added. There's still some tinctures that aren't represented amongst the tinctures they added and uniques. And a lot of these uniques require a lot of balance to really be usable. I would say it's probably 6 usable uniques and like 3 good ones amongst this entire list. So just considering there's like 1,300 uniques in the game actively, I would definitely increase some of these slightly in their efficacy, because otherwise, you know, they're just gonna rot, unfortunately. Some things like the Living Blade or like the Pacify Ring, you know, the Queller, are like actually unusable items at the moment. So would love to see those buffed, but overall, yeah, that's the review of the second half. Let me know what you guys think. And if not, I'll see you in the next video. I've been Matt Lighty, and have a good day.